This is Justice, History, and the Law. Lectures, discussions, and interviews from the Robert H. Jackson Center in Jamestown, New York.
Today we present Professor Diane Marie Amann. She will discuss women and their influence at the Nuremberg trials.
I'm delighted to be here. The topic that I'm going to talk about, it's not quite women at the International Military Tribunal because there was essentially one. I'm going to talk more broadly about women at Nuremberg, not so much the first trial of the major war criminals, but the subsequent trials, of which there were many, often organized by subject matter, the justice case, judges who had perpetrated miscarriages of justice in their courtroom, the doctor's trial, the physicians who conducted medical experiments in the concentration camps, the industrialist trials, of which there were 3, and then to a smaller extent, some of the military proceedings that were undertaken in the British and French zones. It wasn't only Americans who were engaging in the process of war crimes tribunals at the time, but most of them took place in or around Nuremberg, and so that's what I'll talk about. Now, I should say that many of us who work in this field owe our interest to international criminal law, at least in part, to the Nuremberg trials. That's certainly so in my case. Cementing my own interest in this area was Telford Taylor's indispensable memoir, written in 1992 and called The Anatomy of the Nuremberg Trials. At a much more exalted level, Judge Pillay, now the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, apparently also came to her interest in international criminal law through the Nuremberg trials. I've come across an article that reports that she came across the Nuremberg trials on a shelf in the library at the University of Natal in apartheid South Africa. As a student enrolled for classes for non-whites, Judge Pillay is of East Indian heritage, Pillay spent hours reading the trial transcripts, transfixed by the ideal of justice represented in the account of the countries coming together to hold individuals responsible for the most heinous of acts. I am sure that those are not the only 2 examples that we could give in this room of individuals who have been influenced by the work of these trials. Now, until not so long ago, I had assumed that women played little, if any, role in these trials. My reading of Telford Taylor's Anatomy left me but one recollection of women at Nuremberg, and this is it. As some of you may know, in July of 1946, about 3 weeks before Robert H. Jackson delivered the prosecutor's closing statement at the first Nuremberg trial, a Paris designer invented the belly-button-bearing bathing suit that he called Le Bikini, named after the South Pacific atoll at which the US had just exploded the first atomic bomb test. The bikini made its debut in Nuremberg the very same summer and obviously left an indelible impression. Here is an excerpt from Taylor's memoir. The occasion was a dinner party that Catherine Biddle, the wife of Judge Biddle, who was disparaged in the letter that we heard earlier, the American judge at Nuremberg, held for her husband's 60th birthday. It was at the villa that they had requisitioned as their home. All the members of all 4 delegations, the Russians, the French, the British, and the Americans, were invited. It was a lovely evening, Taylor wrote. The food and drink were served outdoors around the large swimming pool, and Catherine, an accomplished poetess, spoke charmingly of enduring love. And then here's the kicker. After dinner, the swimming pool was put to use. The first 2 in were Jenny Prado and Janine Hérisson, among the prettiest and the youngest of the French delegation, who appeared in what were soon to be known as bikinis. Few, if any of us, had previously seen these provocative garments, and the sides of the pool were soon crowded with ogling males. And so this, circa 1946 image, remained for many years my own personal image of women at Nuremberg. I should say that Taylor's account is not unique in this regard. If you read many of the memoirs that were written of the time or historical accounts, there are very, very few mentions of women. Catherine Feight's name does not appear prominently, surely not prominently in these. The women's names you do see, and I think we should hesitate before we congratulate women for their nurturing tendencies too much, because the two names that we do see are Eva Braun, Hitler's mistress, who died with him in the bunker, and Ilse Koch, the wife of the Buchenwald camp superintendent, known politely as Beast of Buchenwald, but I am sure that you can imagine the B word that was more typically used to describe her. Occasionally, you would hear of witnesses, women who testified at the trials, and occasionally in some of the memoirs there are references to Tanya Long, who was one of the New York Times correspondents at Nuremberg. Ben Ferencz said in an interview that he remembers no women at the first trial in any capacity. And surely no woman is mentioned as serving as a judge, a defense lawyer, or a prosecutor, in particular at the first trial. Thus, it is no surprise that in a 2005 speech, Judge Patricia Wald, who we're honored to have with us today, could name no woman among what Frances Biddle, the American judge, called the exceptionally strong supporting cast of lawyers who assisted the judges. Those lawyers who were named included 2 former Supreme Court law clerks and 2 law professors. All of them were men holding positions in the profession not then open to women. It is true that a woman did clerk for the U.S. Supreme Court in 1944, but she was not succeeded by another woman until 1966. As for academia in that period of time, when World War II ended, the exact number of women with tenure or on the tenure track in law schools belonging to the AALS, the Law School Professional Society, was 3 in the entire country. It is therefore truly remarkable that the women we're about to talk about succeeded in working as lawyers at Nuremberg and in the roles that they played. Now, I should say, fittingly, it was at Nuremberg, at a conference I attended with David, in a conference that began in the main courtroom at the Palace of Justice, that I did learn that women, in fact, did play a role at Nuremberg. And that was thanks to a book by Peter Heigl called, in English, The Nuremberg Trials. It's a tourist book with a lot of photographs in it. And what struck me was that many of the photographs included women in all the roles except judge. And so that piqued my interest and led me to begin to look more. And what I'm going to try to do today is really take you through a photo gallery to give you examples of women who worked in these proceedings, who participated in all the different ways, and then conclude by spending a little bit more time talking about one woman in particular who deserves as much attention and as much honor and memory, surely, as Catherine Feit. So if we begin, we see that in these random pictures I've picked up, there are women. This is a photo that I found described only as the prosecution team. There are 2 women in this picture. There are women in the background at a press conference of defendants in the major trial. The Ruscha case was one of the SS cases, and we see women again at the prosecution table. Here, interestingly enough, is a picture simply identified as the Soviet prosecution team, and there are 2 women there. I don't know what their status was, but clearly they're allowed at the council table. We've seen this picture in John's lecture of the staffers arriving for the very first time at Nuremberg, and there's Catherine Feit in the beginning. She was, of course, not the only staffer. There were some who were not lawyers at all. One of those was Virginia Gill. She's the woman with the hand above her cheek, sitting next to, I believe, Taylor. And then the woman to her other side is General Clay's wife. And I think General Clay may be the other gentleman there. sitting and watching proceedings. She was the essentially chief administrative officer, clerk of the court, if you will. Another woman who is going to have a name that some of us here recognize was Edith Simon Colliver. As Edith Simon, she was born in Germany, came to the United States, earned a bachelor's degree at Berkeley, and became a translator in the post-war era. In fact, she was one of the translators at the San Francisco conference that led to the adoption of the UN Charter. She makes her way to Nuremberg, and at age 23, she became a translator, her chief task being translating the pretrial testimony of Hermann Göring. And as she said in an interview, he was not particularly thrilled to see a woman, a Jewish woman, acting as his interpreter. At one point, they spent so much time together, because she was also translating during his interrogation, that she says, I don't know what came over me, but I had him sign a program. And then I thought, what am I doing getting an autograph from him at Nuremberg? And she felt so creeped out about it that she went to her boss and she said, would you please sign this too? I feel awkward having this. And so her boss did sign it and then put an arrow next to Göring's signature and said, to Edith Simon, who helped hang this man. Now, the reason that some of you may recognize the name is her daughter is Sandra Colliver, who is a lawyer at Open Society Justice Initiative, had been executive director of an NGO called Center for Justice and Accountability in San Francisco before that. Others were Catherine Feit, you've seen this picture, and then Elsie Douglas, who was Justice Jackson's secretary. There were many, many women witnesses, for the simple reason that there were many, many women victims. This is a picture of 3 Polish survivors of the Ravensbrück concentration camp, Maria Kusmerczyk, Władysława Karolewska, and Jadwiga Żydo, talking to a nurse about their experience. This is a picture of Żydo, one of the women in the other picture, essentially giving her testimony in silence at Nuremberg, as a doctor uses her essentially as a model to explain the medical experimentation that was conducted on her legs. This is in the doctor's trial. Her testimony helped get 16 convictions in that trial. 7 of those individuals were executed. The woman in this picture is only known as Anna M. Her privacy was protected for the reason that she was one of the victims of forced sterilization during the Nazi era. She testified in the justice trial against the judge who was responsible for the order forcing her to be sterilized. In that trial, 10 individuals were convicted, 4 of whom received life sentences. Other evidence also clearly implicated women. This is footage from film that was shown during one of the trials of a woman being dragged away during a demonstration. This is a photo of people being lined up for the firing squad at the Warsaw Ghetto. Obviously, there are many women wearing skirts in that picture. As I said, there were women who committed war crimes and atrocities during World War II. 2 of them were put on trial in the principal trials at Nuremberg before the American Nuremberg Military Tribunal. One of them was Dr. Hertha Oberhäuser, who was a dermatologist who conducted medical experiments and was the sole woman defendant in the doctor's trial. She was convicted and received 20 years, but was released in 1952 over great outcry and in fact opened a medical practice again in Germany. Once that was discovered, a victims group got together and lobbied successfully to have Germany pull her medical license. They did not feel she had the privilege to engage in the practice of medicine after her conviction. The other defendant in one of these Nuremberg Military Tribunal trials, the only other woman to have been put on trial, is Inga Vermetz, who was essentially an aide or an associate to an SS officer. in a trial called the Ruscha case, which involved the Nazi pureblood programs. She was acquitted at that trial. Other defendants, as I mentioned, included Ilse Kach from Buchenwald, Maria Mandel, who was an Auschwitz guard who would be executed after her conviction in a secondary proceeding, and then many, many camp guards, dozens and dozens and dozens of camp guards who were women were prosecuted. This was the Bergen-Belsen trial, which I believe was a British proceeding. There were journalists who were women, quite a few journalists who were women, of all nationalities. The woman with the pencil is an American. The women at the table are French. As I mentioned, one of the women who wrote a lot for the New York Times was Tanya Long. Her husband is sitting next to her. His name is Ray Daniel. They were initially assigned together overseas by the Times. She was brought on during the war, and Ray Daniel objected to her assignment and wrote back to his editors, "You don't want a girl, this is a man's job." Well, she must have proved her mettle, because within 2 years he married her and they worked together as journalists for the rest of their career. Another journalist was Erika Mann, Thomas Mann's daughter, known as the 20th century's most intriguing nonconformist. She was unique in her journalism because, as a rather famous, or from a famous family, native German speaker, she was actually able to interview the defendants, one of the very few journalists who did that. Victoria Ocampo, an Argentine intellectual. Janet Flanner, shown here with Hemingway, a colleague of hers, who wrote for The New Yorker and was quite biting and rather critical, particularly of Jackson and his cross-examination of Goering, and was known to write in The New Yorker, much I'm sure to the dismay of the people at Nuremberg, how, quote, dull and incoherent, unquote, the proceedings were. Martha Gellhorn, one of the wives of Ernest Hemingway, who encouraged her to become a war correspondent. She had been a fashion writer, and she covered the Spanish Civil War. She covered D-Day, Dachau, Nuremberg, and very late in her life, she covered the US invasion of Panama. Rebecca West, a famous English writer who wrote 2 books after Nuremberg, and is said in Telford Taylor's account to have had a dalliance, as what he called a brief encounter, with Francis Biddle during the course of the trial. Now, if you look at this picture for just a second, there's something here in this composite that I think is important to note. 2 of these women were openly lesbian, Janet Flanner and Erika Mann. And I think it's interesting to remind us of how many different ways sex and gender was playing out in this very tense and I think chaotic word was the word that John used, period. All right? There's no question the way that Janet Flanner presents herself that she would have been masculine in the time. Erika Mann as well. Both of them lived openly with women. And so it's kind of interesting to think about that and to fold that into our story. In fact, of course, sex and gender played throughout the trials. Given Hitler's antipathy to what he would have called misogynization, how could it not be? Given that so much of his philosophy was about fertility, if you will, how could it not be? I found an article in the New York Times from September of 1934 where Hitler gives a speech at Nuremberg saying that the policy of Nazism is essentially to keep women in the maternity ward, and that the role of women is to give children. And interestingly, he attributes any contrary ideas either to liberalism or to, quote, Jewish intellectualism, unquote. So he's clearly meshing his ethnic hatreds with a very clear and defined role for women. Now, the perverse thing about this particular speech is it was delivered at Nuremberg to 2,000 women politicians who were Nazi activists and great supporters and organizers for the party. So I find that also gives us a flavor of the tension at the time, that he's putting forward this very conservative view of the women's role and asking these women to go out and make it happen. when in fact the very fact of them going out is undercutting his philosophy. The victims, as I've said, many of them were women. These are women working at the AGFA, now the photo company, a subsidiary of IG Farben. This was a photograph that was used in the trials to talk about forced labor. The women in the very dark clothes were actually prison inmates from a prison in Munich who were forced to work here. Also from the justice trial, there was a lot of testimony about gender-related issues. I talked about the forced sterilization earlier. If you have seen the movie Justice at Nuremberg, you will recognize this as Judy Garland, who plays in that film a woman who comes to testify about the killing of her landlord. And the story was, she is considered Aryan. Her landlord was a Jewish businessman about 30 years older than her. He was seen to have let her sit on his lap at one time. That was the full extent of any physical or sexual contact ever identified at the trial between them. He is convicted under the Nuremberg laws for quote-unquote race defilement and was guillotined at a prison in Munich for that. And she comes to the justice trial. There's no picture of the actual woman. This was the best I could do. She comes to the justice trial, testifies about that event, and helps convict the judge who was responsible for that judgment. Now, there are many, many lawyers at Nuremberg, and I'm just going to give you a list of some of the people about whom I could find very little information or for whom I could find no photographs online. Irma Von Nunes gives us another echo of that issue of sort of gender identity. She was admitted to the Georgia bar at age 19 in the 20s. She was a WAC captain by the time Nuremberg happens. She is said, although I haven't been able to confirm this except in one place, to have been the first woman involved in the war crimes trials. I have no idea what that means. But it's interesting about her that a newspaper article describes her as Little Miss Von Nunes, who likes to wear her hair cut like a boy's, is very masculine and says she will never marry. And so again, there's sort of this innuendo about what kind of person, what kind of woman would get involved in these trials. Sadie Arbuthnot was involved in the justice case, earned her law degree at night school while she was a Department of Justice secretary, I presume during the New Deal, and goes on to become the first woman judge in the US court system in Germany after the war. Of course, the US held occupation of Germany for a while, and we had our own justice system. Belle Mayer-Zeck worked on the Farben trial. She married William Zeck, who was another member of the prosecution team. She and he both went back to Suffern, New York, I believe that's Westchester County, and became Democratic Party activists. She actually ran for the legislature unsuccessfully at one time. She surfaces at age 76 writing a letter to the New York Times setting them straight on the legacy of the Nuremberg trial. I will show you that quote in a little bit. She died at age 86 in 2006 on the same day as Drexel Sprecher, another prosecutor from Nuremberg. Others about whom I've been able to find out a little bit are Dr. Eileen Shalufur, and I'd like to mention her because she is actually the subject of a letter by Catherine Fite back to her parents. And she says that she had met this wonderful French woman who speaks excellent English. Apparently, the brother of Shalufur was someone that Catherine Fite had met in her earlier State Department days, and she said, "It's so great to meet her because I have so little female companionship these days." And again, that's a reminder of how lonely these women must have been at that time. Shalufur worked for de Gaulle in Canada during World War II, and she was one of 3 prosecutors in the Ravensbrück trial, which was a British military trial dealing with a concentration camp. Interestingly enough, and I have our colleague Kevin Heller to thank for this observation, there were many defense attorneys at Nuremberg who were women. Perhaps this should be less of a surprise because there probably weren't a lot of male German lawyers left to be defense lawyers. And so maybe there was more of an opportunity for women in that particular role. It's also notable that, as you see, many of them had PhDs, which would be a classic track in Europe. But so they were very, very educated women. A few of them, Gerda Dürzer, Agnes Nath-Schreiber, their husbands were the chief counsels. They had a practice together, and so they worked as associate counsel to their husband. One of the women for whom I have found a picture is Dr. Erna Krön, I guess it would be pronounced. She was at the Farben trial and goes on to have a 30-year career as a leading music director, of all things, in Germany, in her hometown of Leverkusen. Now, perhaps from what I have found so far, the most interesting woman defense lawyer, and surely the most prominent, would have been Elisabeth Gombell, and that is because she is the only woman to have served either as a prosecutor or as a defense lawyer as chief counsel for her client. And she was the main counsel. Yes, I just heard Mr. Kimming say it. She was Bohle's eternal, Ernst Wilhelm Bohle, who was a Foreign Department officer in the Nazi administration and was tried in the ministry's case of members of various ministries. She had been a legal advisor in the Junkers aircraft factory before the trial, and she becomes the chief counsel. Apparently, the person originally appointed dropped out for reasons I've not been able to find out. But there's a gender story here, too, and I'll read to you a quote from an account of the Nuremberg trials by an Illinois attorney named John Appleman, and his comment about her representation of her client. He writes, "The indictment in Case 11, commonly called the Ministry's case, was filed November 1st and served upon defendants November 4th. The defendants were arraigned on December 20th, and much to the amazement of the tribunal, prosecution, and all persons concerned, one defendant pleaded guilty. The defendant Ernst Wilhelm Bohle pleaded guilty to membership of the SS with knowledge of its criminal activities, and incidentally was found guilty only upon this count and sentenced to 5 years imprisonment." And here's his kicker line. "One wonders whether the fact that he had a woman counsel had anything to do with his decision to enter a plea of guilty." I find that a fascinating comment. I don't know if he's saying that, of course, she was too weak to go through with actually having the entire trial, or if she was the wisest of all the lawyers because he ends up getting the shortest sentence at the end of the day. I fear that it's probably the former, but the latter would hold true as well. I have pictures for 3 of the women prosecutors, and I want to introduce you to the first two and then dwell on the last one. The first one is Dorothea, or Dottie, Greater-Minskoff. She worked in the ministry's case. She was married to Emanuel Minskoff, who was also a prosecutor. What's interesting here is I have found a reference to the fact that when she went back to the United States to work, I believe, for the American Bankers Association, she used her maiden name, Dottie Greater, and I think this is a reminder of humility for those of us who were on this side of the Atlantic during World War II. She used her maiden name not to hide that she was married, but because she could not be hired if it was found that she had married a Jewish man. And so she used her other name. And we shouldn't forget that discrimination worked more subtly, but surely was present in our own country as well. Mary Kaufman, a really interesting character. She worked, I believe, on the Farben case, one of the industrial cases. I think she is more interesting for her life outside of Nuremberg than at Nuremberg. She had been an organizer for the Works Progress Administration during the New Deal, went to law school part-time, and John earned her law degree at St. John's. She became a lawyer for the National Labor Relations Board, after that continuing to organize for the WPA, and eventually finds her way to Nuremberg. What's interesting about her is what she does after Nuremberg. She became one of the leading lawyers for communists tried under the Smith Act during the blacklisting in the McCarthy eras. She was a leading civil rights lawyer, a lawyer for the poor. She was the lawyer of communist Elisabeth Flynn, among others, involved in a trial in which one of the co-defendants was Dashiell Hammett, was a tireless, radical attorney in the consequent years, a founding member of the National Lawyers Guild, very active in Vietnam anti-war protests as a lawyer for people who were arrested, and in fact developed stump speech, if you will, which linked the war crimes of the Nuremberg era to what she saw as the war crimes of the United States during the Vietnam era. So had a very, very interesting career after her time at Nuremberg. The last person I'd like to talk about and tell you a little bit more about is Cecilia Goetz. She was born in 1918 in New York City. Her father was a lawyer. She herself decided to study law and earned all of her degrees at NYU. She graduated at the top of her class from NYU Law School in 1940, and in fact was the editor-in-chief of the NYU Law Review, and in fact was the first woman to head any major law review in the country, in history. Notwithstanding that, she could not find a job after graduation. One of her classmates explained years later, Cecilia Goetz's life was truly the law. Her concentrated experience as editor-in-chief of the Law Review could not be followed by jobs in the private or judicial systems as a clerk to a judge. That was totally unavailable at the time. Limited opportunities came to be available in the federal government at the beginning of World War II, when men were being drafted or otherwise joined the armed services. But even under those circumstances, she found it hard to get a job in Washington. She spent 2 years working in her father's firm in New York. She tried and aspired to be a trial attorney for the government, but when she tried, and I'm quoting a different author here, but when she tried to gain such a role, even in departments known to be headed by liberals, the prejudice against females as government litigators rose up as a solid wall. It was suggested that she was, quote, much too attractive to be a good lawyer, unquote. She persevered and eventually landed a job in the early 40s in the Justice Department in the Civil Division. She became the first woman ever to be offered a supervisory role in the DOJ, and she turned it down. Why did she turn it down? She decided she wanted to go to Nuremberg. She worked through the bureaucratic avenues to try to get a position in Nuremberg and found one blind alley after another. She was turned down because of her gender. She wrote at one point a letter saying, you must have nurses there, you must have secretaries there. Where are they staying? Let me say there. Because the reason that they gave her for turning her down was there was nowhere to put a woman, that all the barracks or whatever were reserved for men. Eventually, she went over the heads of all the bureaucrats and somehow got in touch with Taylor himself. And he, to his credit, decided quite quickly that he wanted to hire her. But there was a problem. In order for her hiring papers to be processed, Taylor had to sign a waiver of disability form, the disability being that she was a woman. He did that, and she went to Nuremberg. She worked on, in particular, the Krupp case, and in many ways was probably the most prominent of all the women at Nuremberg, both because she was one of the 3 major associate counsel on this. She eventually became a tax lawyer. I suspect that her expertise in industry was invaluable. She had worked for the Office of Price Stabilization at one point. And she ends up being the only woman, as far as I know, other than the one defense lawyer I mentioned, who gave an opening argument at Nuremberg. The practice then was for the prosecutors to take turns reading what was a very long opening statement. And so she is one of the 5 Americans that reads the opening statement at Krupp. What's interesting about that is that apparently it caused a ripple of excitement and astonishment in the courtroom, to the point that when she finished reading, the second that there was a break, the British delegation in particular stood up and started hugging her and congratulating her on her performance. Now, the reason that I find this astonishing is that I've read the opening statement and it's nothing special. It's clearly a script. There is no change in authorship from one reader to another. She doesn't have any really great lines. There's one line about miserable slave labor, and otherwise it's fairly plodding. But it gives you a sense of how just the fact that a woman stood up and did it and didn't fall down in the course of it, how astonishing that was at the time. She also was very actively engaged in examinations and cross-examinations of the witnesses that there were. Her cross-examinations, the excerpts that I've been able to read, reveal her as a very good lawyer. The Germans, like all good hostile witnesses, tried to turn the question around or dodge the question. She was very tenacious in trying to get them to answer the question posed and not accepting their, oh, well, it was somebody else or something like that. So it's quite clear that she was a very good lawyer. After Nuremberg ends, she goes back home. She works in the practice at a number of firms, including the Kay Scholler firm in New York. She focuses on tax, gets an LLM from NYU in tax, and eventually in 1978, she becomes the first woman ever appointed to the Federal Bankruptcy Court in the Second Circuit. And she was a bankruptcy judge for the rest of her life. She also was a founder of the National Association of Women's Judges and very active on behalf of women and the law. She tended to downplay her role as a first woman. She would go to those sorts of things and worked as a mentor. But in a line that I'd like to quote you that I found rather interesting given the recent vetting of Justice Sotomayor, she doesn't think that there's a difference between a woman judge and a man judge. And so I'll read you her quote. "Once you put on a robe, the male-female distinction disappears, at least as far as the people who appear before you are concerned. They don't see you as either a male or a female. The judge's role overrides the individual. I really don't see any essential difference between a good male and a good female judge. All judges must have patience, a willingness to learn, compassion, and above all, integrity. I'm afraid there's nothing very startling in all of that." Now, one of the things that's interesting about Cecilia Goetz is she never writes about Nuremberg. And from my mind, this is one of the more interesting things about all of the women at Nuremberg. None of them wrote their memoirs, unlike a lot of men on the prosecution team. A couple of them were involved sort of editors as other projects, but there's not even a full-on law review article by any of these women. There's only one set of remarks by Goetz that's published in any law review. And there, she talks about why that might be. And she says, "I'm very glad to be here today." It was actually a New York Law School symposium in honor of Telford Taylor, I believe soon after he passed away. And she says, "I have never spoken or written about Nuremberg, and I have myself often wondered why that is." And what's interesting is that in part, she volunteers that it's because she was so critical of Nuremberg, that she was very embittered by the way that the industrialist trials came out. In 2 of the 3 industrialist trials, the judges' panels accepted the Germans' claim that, essentially of duress, Hitler made me do it, and that was an acceptable defense. She was very proud that in the trials she worked most on, Krupp, the defense was not accepted. But then later on, after Krupp and others were convicted, he got a very light sentence. And actually, I pardon that. He was sentenced. But then what happened as the case went up for administrative review through the political branches of government, eventually his sentence was commuted to time served and all his property was restored, which of course was profoundly important given the expanse of the Krupp domain. And the anguish that she felt over that, even she talks about feeling guilty for having put certain witnesses on the stand because now that Krupp was out, she feared that they would suffer reprisals, left her with a very bitter taste about Nuremberg. She also says, it was not a happy place. She says, this was the most important work of my life and the unhappiest time of my life. This is what Nuremberg looked like in that time. And imagine what it would have been like, regardless of gender issues, to have worked in that environment of pure misery. They were not allowed to fraternize with the Germans, contrary to the Justice at Nuremberg dalliance between Marlene Dietrich and Spencer Tracy. That was not condoned. And so they felt very isolated. None of them knew German. That would have isolated them anyway. They did not see the Nuremberg that I saw when I was there in 2007. And then the last thing that she says, sort of in passing, and not quite in the way that I think she may have meant it, was she says that there was pervasive gender bias. And what's interesting is she uses the term to describe why she had such a hard time getting hired. But of course, it couldn't have been very easy to be a woman in that environment for any of these women. There is, after all, the bikini and the objectification of women, right? And I should say that I actually see this as a great juxtaposition because, of course, the bikini liberated women in its own way. And so there's a great tumult of changing roles. And the woman in the bikini on the left and Cecilia Goetz on the right are really part and parcel of the same social phenomenon going on. But the idea that even when you stood up and just did your job, it was this special moment, and that you were so strange. To have dealt with that day in and day out must have been very difficult. To give you an idea of how that pervaded, some of you may know Joseph Persico's book on Nuremberg. And one of his complaints was about the women at Nuremberg. And he said, in one point talking about the translators, and here I think back to Edith Simon Colliver, he says, in complaint, gruff German generals had their testimony translated by young women with chirpy little voices, and this diminished the power of the witness's testimony. And so that whatever they did, no matter how they did it, how well they did it, how accurate that translation was, the fact that they were there was not accepted. And that must have been incredibly difficult. Notwithstanding, many of these women went on to fascinating and important careers, continued to be path breakers. Not all of them. Some of them appear to have gone home, essentially. Even the woman in the bikini, one of the French secretaries, went on to have a great career as a translator in France. She's translated every major American novel into French. Many of them kept in their own quieter places the same dedication to Nuremberg that some of their peers did. And I'll leave you with two quotes from two of the women prosecutors I've mentioned that are sort of emblematic of that. One is that letter to the editor by Belle Mayer-Zek. At age 76, I believe in the mid-90s, the New York Times did a commemoration magazine issue about World War II, and they talked about Nuremberg in the context of ex post facto laws and said that it really was on unstable grounds, possibly illegitimate. It was, after all, only international law. And here was her response. To dismiss treaties and international conventions as creative is to deny that international law exists. The fact that enforcement procedures are lacking in these conventions does not vitiate their effect. That's a quote that all of us could pull out of our bag now and again. And then here is our lawyer's lawyer, Cecilia Goetz, also in the same period, in the mid-90s, talking about her experience and her frustration with the Krupp trial. I'm still outraged, she said at age 80. It was a total miscarriage of justice. Thank you.
In part 2, CBS White House correspondent Bill Plante discusses how he started in network news.
I'm delighted to be here. The 100th anniversary of Justice Marshall's birth provides a wonderful takeoff point for me to talk about what I first did when I came into network news. Now, I hasten to add, I was asked to be brief, and I will be. I mean, for those of us in television, brevity is the usual. We get a minute and a half. In fact, there's, of course, a story that I love, which I think I first heard from David Brinkley, which has it that if television had been invented when the Ten Commandments were handed down, the report would have gone something like this. Good evening. From CBS News, this is Newsbreak. At Mount Sinai today, God gave Moses 10 commandments. Here are the 3 most important. So in that spirit, let me tell you why I am really delighted to be here on Justice Marshall's birthday. The civil rights movement was the first thing that I covered when I went to work for CBS News. Was I prepared to do that? Not in any real sense. I'm from Chicago. I had never been further south than St. Louis. I was sent to Philadelphia, Mississippi in summer of 1964, where 3 civil rights workers had been murdered. I might as well have gone to the dark side of the moon for all I understood about what I was about to see and experience. So I have I think, an appreciation for the work that Justice Marshall did in preparing the way for the civil rights movement that I then reported on for the next several years. My wife and I had the opportunity to see the play Thurgood, which is on Broadway, the work of George Stevens. Roger was the founder of the Kennedy Center. I get them confused. George Stevens Jr. wrote Thurgood, and it's a wonderful picture, a wonderful portrait of Justice Marshall and his devotion to the rule of law. It illustrates how Marshall's work with the NAACP in the 30s, 40s, and 50s built the foundation for the civil rights movement of the 50s and 60s and 70s. In the play, there is a line very well delivered by Lawrence Fishburne, who's wonderful in the part, which has Justice Marshall laughing over the idea that after Brown, well, in 5 years, most of the schools would be desegregated. Laughable indeed. I was in high school when Brown was announced. I remember thinking with all the satisfied certainty of a 16-year-old, well, that's the end of segregation. Good. But of course, no such thing. But as Thurgood Marshall moved onto the bench in 1961, the careful and thorough legal approach which he constructed and charted continued. By the time I began working for CBS News in 1964, the civil rights movement had begun in earnest the push for voting rights. The headlines were in the clashes, the arrests, the murderous outrages. But the foundation was the foundation that Thurgood Marshall had put in place, anchored firmly to the rule of law. There was tension between the civil disobedience of Dr. King and the idea of the rule of law. Roger Stevens alludes to it George Stevens alludes to it in the play when he has Marshall suggest that he didn't always agree with Dr. King's tactics. As Stevens put it to me in a conversation, Thurgood thought that you shouldn't break the law. But at the NAACP in the 50s, he defended the Freedom Riders and the civil rights demonstrators. In the play, Stevens has Marshall grumbling a little bit about the fact that they got stuck with the cost of all that. But he just grumbles a bit. The foundation that Thurgood Marshall laid down was in place when Dr. King began his voter registration drives in Alabama in 1965 in January. And that's when I began to cover him regularly. And after the violent clash at the Edmund Pettus Bridge in March, which you saw in my wife's film, the drive culminated in the march from Selma to Montgomery in late March of that year. But the legal battle continued in the courts while the demonstrations went on in the streets. And it was just as key as the demonstrations. I went back and looked at a report that I wrote in early February of 1965. It was for radio. And here's what it said. The battle going on in the courts is more important in many respects, but the demonstrations in the streets provide the drama lacking in the courtroom. So, though a federal injunction last week ordered a speed up in registration, the marching on the Dallas County Courthouse will continue because Negro leaders hope to force the registrar's office to take applicants more often than the 2 days a month provided for by state law. The tension continued as well. Another report from around the same time. There are voices of moderation counseling the Negro leadership to stop demonstrating. The Justice Department reportedly has made a request for an end to the demonstrations. We who covered the movement watched as it provided the impetus that led up to the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which was signed in August. As with Brown, the hopeful assumption that the Voting Rights Act would quickly remedy the inequalities in registration was way too optimistic. The law had to continue to work. The strategy of law underpinned by the strategy of nonviolence underpinned by the rule of law came under a great deal of pressure after the emotional high point of the voting rights signing, because just 5 days later, the riots broke out in Watts. Watts was the first violent uprising of the 60s, a time when the rule of law seemed to be disconnected from the social fabric. Militants applauded the upsetting of order. Conservatives saw it as the consequences of civil rights legislation gone way too far. So I guess in retrospect, it seems to me that the creative tension which existed between the law as Marshall championed it and the push for urgent change is what delivered the most lasting results. And in the end, it is the appeal that people like Justice Marshall made through the law and Dr. King made through his personal witness to what Lincoln so famously called the better angels of our nature, that is what distinguishes us as a people. Thank you very much.
The Jackson Center is a historical and educational facility dedicated to preserving the legacy of this country lawyer who became Solicitor General, Attorney General, a Justice of the Supreme Court, and served as Chief Prosecutor at the Nuremberg trials of Nazi war criminals following World War II. To learn more about this program, Robert Jackson, the Jackson Center, and upcoming events, the Jackson Center is located at 305 East 4th Street, Jamestown, New York, and found on the web at www.roberthjackson.org or contacted by telephoning 716-483-6646.